All right. Well, once again, I'm Corey Lights. I am the bookstore manager here at the Cathedral of St. Philip. Tonight we have joining us, we have Kristine Anderson. She is local Georgia author. She has written a book called The Crooked Truth. She's here to share with you about her book, and we have moderating this event, Barbara Pendergast. Barbara, most of you might know, she is a member of our cathedral, and she's a chaplain and spiritual director here at the church. So we're very excited to have her, and thank you, Barbara, for joining us. A little bit about Kristine. Kristine, like I said, is local. She lives here in Smyrna. She earned her PhD in communicative arts from Georgia State University, and also has worked as a freelance writer for both national newspapers and magazines. She has taught high school and also courses in college at Shorter College in the Southern Polytechnic State University. And now she's a part of the Kennesaw University. She's a longtime Episcopalian and has been involved in several parishes around the Atlanta Diocese. So welcome, Kristine. Her book, The Crooked Truth, just came out. It won the Farrell Sams Fiction Award for capturing the human condition in Southern contexts. This book is published by Mercer University Press. Once again, we're very excited to have you tonight. So Barbara, I'm going to open it up to you and Kristine. I think she's muted. Are you muted? Okay. Barbara is.
Thanks. I needed your
everybody.
I needed your permission to unmute. Welcome, everyone. And Kristine, thanks for being here, and thanks for the Cathedral Bookstore sponsoring this. Kristine, as a way to get started, could you tell us how you came to write this book and what that process was like, and including the publishing of it?
Be happy to. And first of all, let me say thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate folks coming. One of the big pluses of having a Zoom meeting is the fact that people can come from all over the city, all over the state. And I see some folks here I haven't seen for a while, including some folks north of the Mason-Dixon. So thank you all for coming. I have always been a reader, writer. Ever since I was a little kid, I loved fairy tales. I kept a diary complete with a tiny key. I journaled, and I've always loved stories. And I think we are story creatures. So much of our identity and our sense of our past comes from stories. So I'm always listening for stories. And I did a lot of freelance writing for newspapers and magazines, and I especially enjoyed doing the features because those were more story-oriented type articles. We went, and when I say we, I mean my family, my husband, and my 3 children, and we went to South Georgia where my husband has some relatives. They literally live on a dirt road with about 350 acres, which they lease out primarily for cotton. And while we were there for the annual Labor Day barbecue, I heard a story from an elderly relative. And it was a story that really resonated with me, a story that really touched my heart. It was a story about a couple who lived in Lumpkin, Stewart County, which is almost to Alabama. And they had both been widowed and had children, and they married, and together they had a son. Well, the son, this was back in the early 30s. The son was born a mongoloid, and he was very, very limited. He could barely speak, he couldn't tie his shoes. Of course, he didn't go to school because there weren't any schools available for mongoloids at that point. But he was a very sweet, loving boy, and his mother always said he would never hurt a flea. Well, his older half-brother was very cruel and abusive to him. He called him moron, he called him dimwit, he made fun of him, and as the mongoloid got older and older, he made him do more and more of the heavy farm work. When the father died, he was doing almost all of the farm work, and tensions grew and grew and grew, and finally, one day, things blew up. And I won't tell you what happened. You'll have to read the book to find out. But that story, which I scribbled on napkins at the cookout, was part of the seed for Crooked Truth. The other part came from the experience I had working with a little boy who had Downs. And this little boy, unlike the boy in the story, did go to public school in Cobb County. He was in special classes, but he too was very limited. He could read a little, he knew what money was, but he couldn't understand the difference between coins. He could count to 5 or 6, but he couldn't tie his shoes. He had a hard time with zippers. But unlike the boy in the story, he was very well liked, and the kids at school never made fun of him. He was accepted and they looked out for him. Well, that experience, plus the fact that I had this freelance experience doing newspaper and magazine articles, made me want to write a historical novel. And I foolishly thought, because I had all this newspaper and magazine writing, that I could transfer those skills into writing a novel. But I soon found that was not at all realistic, because I had to create believable characters, a plot. I had to create a setting, a small fictitious community in South Georgia called Crisscross. I needed a theme, dialogue. There were so many pieces to bring together. So I got myself a writing coach. I joined a critique group. I went to conferences. And finally, after almost 4 years, I started writing what we call query letters, because in traditional publishing, you cannot approach most publishers without an agent. You have to have an agent to open the doors. So I wrote probably 40, maybe 50 query letters. Some people said, send me the first chapter. Some people said, send me the first 5 chapters. Some people just sent me a form rejection. But nobody said, I've got to represent you. I've got to have that manuscript. And I got pretty discouraged. Well, then I found out about Mercer Press's Feral Sam's Fiction Award. And Feral Sam's, most of you probably know if you're Georgia raised and have lived here for a while. Feral Sam's was an MD who did his undergrad at Mercer. And they established an award in his honor for the best short story or novel that speaks to the human condition in a Southern context. So, literally, at the 11th hour, I bundled up my manuscript, rushed over to the FedEx office, and sent it down to Macon. Then I started lighting candles, offering prayers. And lo and behold, 6 months later, I got a call from the editor. And Crooked Truth had won the Feral Sam's Fiction Award and I got a contract for publication. I was thrilled because I didn't have an agent. But I didn't know that getting the contract did not mean I was going to go to press in the next month or two. It meant another wait, more revisions, more editing. So finally, after 2 years and many, many reams of paper, which we do recycle, Crooked Truth was ready for publication. So we went from a couple of napkins at a Labor Day cookout to a finished book. But I don't want you all to think that it was a smooth, easy road, because there are lots of twists and turns and many, many dead ends along the way. I originally had a different title, and I had 2 endings until I finally felt the current ending seemed right. So it was a long process, but I finished. So thank you all for listening. And Hewlin, my husband, is going to read a selection from the 2nd chapter. And this is a selection where 3 of the major characters are introduced. We've already met our narrator, who is a 15-year-old boy, Lucas. And Lucas has come to live with his grandparents after his parents were killed in a car wreck. He's been on the farm since he was about 3. And he also is Robert, his Mongoloid uncle's reluctant caretaker. So the scene involves Lucas, his Mongoloid uncle, his grandparents, and Alvin Earl, the abusive older uncle, who continually taunts and torments Robert. And they've all gathered on a Saturday night as Granny plays the piano and Robert and Lucas sing. And here's Hewlin.
Hello, it's always a pleasure to get to read the book. We've been 5 years in the making or more, and so it's a pleasure just to read a couple of lines from the book. As we sang, I heard Alvin Earl come in the back door and poke around the kitchen, searching for some leftover supper. When he couldn't find anything to eat, he came into the parlor and leaned against the wall. He wore a starched white shirt, and his shoes had more polish on them than Granny's piano. He'd slicked back his hair to hide his bald spot, and I could smell the vitalis from across the room. A little dab of toilet paper clung to his chin, soaking up the blood from a shaving nick, and he had a cigarette stuck behind his ear. Granny droned on, and I heard a deep voice on the radio announcing tonight's episode of the Mystery Theater. Fixing my eyes on the mantel clock, I slowly inched toward the kitchen, eager to make my escape. Robert, enjoying an audience, started another round of Clementine, and he swayed to the music. He had a high, sweet voice, but little bubbles of spit popped up on his lip when he sang, and he always got the words mixed up. After he finished the last line, Alvin Earl clapped and asked, "You can train a monkey or a dog to do tricks. Which one are you?" Granny jerked her pale fingers off the keys and froze. Alvin Earl's question hung in the air like a bad note, and silence filled the room. When no one answered, he asked again, is he a trained monkey or a circus dog doing tricks? Glancing at Robert, I knew he didn't catch the sarcasm in Alvin Earl's voice or understand the question. He thought it was funny and laughed. I'm not a monkey. I'm not a dog. I'm your brother. I don't get a word he's saying. He talks like he's got a mouthful of grits. Pulling out his lighter with a one-eyed Jack insignia, he flipped the top open. Then he spun the little rubber wheel around with his thumb. Robert stared at the silver lighter, and Granny frowned.
Thank you, Hewlin.
Thank you, Hewlin.
We have to give Hewlin an extra thank you because tonight the Braves are playing the LA Dodgers.
And they're ahead 2-0.
And he just told me they're ahead 2-0. So he is sitting in here reading rather than watching the Braves. Thank you, Hewlin.
Well, at this point, I wanted to let people know where you can get the book. And I believe that's up on the screen. You can get it at the Cathedral Bookstore. So the website's there, or you could just call the Cathedral Bookstore number, and that website is available on the Cathedral main website. So now we have time for a few Q&As, and Kristine, I thought I might lead off with a question for you. Where do you get your ideas for the dialogue? Does it come from you, or does it come from your characters? And when it does come from the characters, how do you know that you can trust the dialogue? What's that process like for you?
I think I am a character-driven writer, and I like to write characters' dialogue, but dialogue can be very tricky because to be convincing, to be real, it really has to reflect the character's voice, which means the writer has to step outside their voice and become that character. So I think the dialogue becomes easier and easier to write, and hopefully more believable, more natural, as writers get to know their characters better, as writers live with their characters. And I have lived with these characters a long time, so they're very real to me. But good dialogue really helps the reader nail the characters down.
And how did you make Alvin Earl so real? One of our participants is saying that she was surprised at some of the emotions that Alvin Earl evoked in her. Did you know someone like him, or?
Yes. I've had several relatives with drinking issues and some gambling issues. And I'm glad my mother is not here to hear me admit that on screen. But I think most families do have relatives with alcohol and maybe gambling issues. So Alvin Earl was a combination of people.
If people have questions, they can put it in the chat. And while we're looking for those, I have another question that has been asked before. Have you experienced a time when the story was going one way and then it unexpectedly took a turn that you may or may not have seen coming?
Yes. And I think that was one reason why the writing took so long. As I said, I had 2 endings before I finally felt comfortable with the current ending. And when I started doing Crooked Truth, I tried to outline each chapter. I outlined individual scenes within a chapter. And then I found as I got more into the characters, and they did become more real, that I was not as focused on the outline because the characters were telling me where they wanted to go, what they wanted to do, what they didn't want to do, what they were afraid of, what they felt conflicted about. So they did become very real.
And we have another person who's asked, how did you envision Crisscross?
Crisscross is, in fact, I actually have a bird's eye sketch on my wall of the farm and the square in Crisscross. Crisscross in many ways is the typical southern town with the square with the Confederate memorial and the cannons and the small businesses, the bank, the police station, the barber shop, the beauty shops surrounding the town square. And I had an uncle who lived in a small town. For many years, he was the only dentist in this small town. So we spent a lot of time in that small town when we were kids.
How has the pandemic changed your writing style, or has it?
The pandemic has probably been a blessing to me because it's motivated me to get my butt in the chair and write. It's eliminated a lot of the distractions. And I'm sure most editors will see a lot more manuscripts coming in, because I think many people are reading more and people are writing more. So I've gotten a good bit done on my next book.
Great. Well, towards the end, that's one of my questions to ask as we're getting ready to wrap up. Will the alternative ending be available on the DVD when the movie comes?
Maybe when the movie comes out. Hopefully there will be a movie, maybe even a television series.
How did you come up with the themes in the book? I mean, clearly racism is one theme, classism is a theme, prejudice against people with disabilities is a theme, alcoholism is a theme. How did you know before you started writing that these are themes you wanted to struggle with? And in particular, how did you navigate or know how to use language that was current to the time and wrongfully accepted at the time around Blacks and Robert being called, retarded, or, we don't use that language anymore. And so can you talk a little bit about the themes and how a writer can authentically and with integrity speak to the period in which it was written and to keep the dialogue consistent with that in light of where we are now?
I did a lot of formal and informal research, a lot of interviewing, and I think that was one way my experience in journalism was really helpful, because I've interviewed people and know how to find information. So I interviewed a lot of older people who had lived and grown up in the South. And some of the name calling and behavior and abuse Alvin Earl heaps on Robert came from the comments I got at the Labor Day cookout. Things that this relative remembered actually happening to this family. But I don't think abusive behavior or name calling, unfortunately, is limited to any particular time period. I think we still have, and probably always will have, name calling and abusive behavior. And in terms of including some of the characters, one of the things I learned when talking with some of the elderly residents of this little community in Stewart County was they did have a Jewish family, and that Jewish family operated the one and only movie theater in Lumpkin. So I pulled in that information to introduce Lucas's first real girlfriend, Amelia, because her father is Jewish.
Do you have a target audience for this book? I'm thinking with the themes that you've just mentioned, what a great book this would be for, you know, middle school, upper middle school. Do you have a target audience in particular?
Young adult and adult. My critique group, who has been very supportive, is primarily people who write picture books in middle grade, and they told me repeatedly it was too much for middle grade kids. So, but kids like to read up. Usually they read about characters who are older than they are.
One of your readers says, I was surprised that Robert went to the state hospital. Was that an inevitable part of the narrative that you envisioned?
And I'm going to be careful with my response here because there may be some folks who haven't read the whole book. How many people haven't read the book? So I don't want to reveal any, I don't want to give away any of the information, but Robert's development and his situation seemed like a natural progression for the time and events going on within the family. So I'm hedging on that, Barbara.
Okay. You talked about that you've always been a writer and how writing this novel is different from your journalistic writing. But what do you like the most and the least about writing? And what can you talk about your process? Like, do you sit down and write every day, or do you wait for inspiration, or how does that process work for you?
You can't wait for inspiration. You've got to get your butt in the chair. And I think it really helps if you have some kind of a regular schedule. I like to write in the morning, but if I'm on a deadline, I can write almost any time of the day. Sometimes I'll write late at night. And I think for me, the most difficult part is getting that first draft. And Anne Lamont, whom some of you probably know, she wrote Bird by Bird. She has a chapter on shitty first drafts. And I think most first drafts are pretty shitty. And if you saw the stack of manuscripts in my office, you would see that I do lots and lots of revising. But if I can just get a draft down for a chapter, then I can work with it and develop it and listen to my characters.
I know in your opening on the 14th, your launch, you talked about, and this is in regard to finding dialogue, you talked about eavesdropping in restaurants. And can you say a little more about that? I thought that was very interesting.
Some people might actually describe me as a voyeur. And I think good writers are good listeners, good observers. I think you have to be, because if you want to create credible characters, you have to watch and listen to people. So I'm a people watcher. And I'm very happy to go to the mall and just sit in the food court with a cup of coffee and kind of watch people coming in and out and listen to what they're saying. Watch their faces, especially. But I think that's a prerequisite for anybody, especially who's doing fiction.
That's fascinating.
And people are fascinating, and everybody has a story. But not everyone has the opportunity to share it. But we all have stories.
So when you're listening and you pick up snippets of dialogue and then they happen to fit with your characters, do you go into a kind of stream of consciousness and put yourself in that character? Or how do you know what rings true? Is there, do you know, or does that happen after you get feedback when the book's out in the world? Do you have some sense of when the dialogue has integrity with the characters?
I think because I know my characters, it's almost instinctive. And if I hear something, I think, so-and-so would say that. So it's almost instinctive, because those characters have become very real to me. And people sometimes say writers don't finish a book, they just abandon it because they have another project they need to move on to, or maybe another contract, or maybe even better, an advance.
So is there any process or ritual, or when you finish a book, you're saying goodbye? Can you abandon these characters that are part of you, and their dialogues come out of your soul and your spirit and your hand? I mean, is it like a death, or is it just, what's that like when it's over?
I am sad to lose one of my main characters from Crooked Truth. I grieve for that character. But that's one of the traps, I think, of good writing. You can't be too nice to your characters, because that's not realistic. Characters have problems, conflicts, issues, just like real people. So writers can't insulate their characters. But two of my main characters appear in my next book. So I didn't totally lose everybody. Two will move on.
We'll look forward to that. One of your readers says, I'm in a book club, and so often we read books that have complex characters that can be viewed from different lenses. Do you think it's important to have that complexity, or is it more important for the reader to view a character the way in which you intended?
Readers pick up and take home what they want from a book. Now, everybody on this screen reads a book differently and takes something different from that book, depending on their experience, their needs, their situation. So I don't think most writers would have a guideline or a checklist for things they hope the reader would take away. Because that's part of the beauty of reading. And I think that's one of the reasons why people enjoy a book club, because they like to hear what different people have taken from the book, how different people interpret the characters and the theme. And that's the beauty of a book club discussion. And I hope everybody in my book club hears that.
Another reader asks, and I'll hold the book up, the cover art is wonderful. Is this the Tree of Life? Can you say a little about the cover and how it was designed and what the image might represent?
Cover, that's one of the negatives of working with a publisher. The writer relinquishes a lot of his rights, and for most writers who are not well established, decisions on the cover are made by the publisher. And I initially had a different cover in mind, but the design team with Mercer chose that cover. They did use a couple of things that I had wanted to include, which was the barbed wire fence. And I did have a tree, but the tree was not nearly as big or massive as this tree. But I'm happy with the cover, and I've had a lot of good comments and feedback about the cover.
I think that question illustrates your answer to the previous question, which is how we redact what we read and see through our own lenses. So someone may see this as the Tree of Life, and you had a different vision for it. And what a wonderful thing that you birthed this book, and then it has a life of its own through each of our lenses and our own life story intersecting with this story.
I think the fact that we all do have our own lens is what keeps people reading and reading and reading.
Can you say a little about how you chose the names for your characters, Lucas in particular?
Had a different name originally, but as the theme became more clear and I changed the title to Crooked Truth, I wanted to use the name Lucas because Lucas is related to the verb to illuminate, and Lucas tries to illuminate his way and find his truth. That's Lucas's journey. It may not be a truth he likes, but it's a truth he has to find.
Thank you. We have another question. Who is your favorite author, and did that writing style inform the way you write?
I have so many that I couldn't limit to just one person. Farrell Sams, Pat Conroy, John Steinbeck, Stephen King, Robert Cormier. There's many, Flannery O'Connor. I try to read a lot of different things, and I think that's important for people who want to write. You have to read, and ideally reading outside your genre. You have to see and feel how other writers use language.
Did you know the book was finished when it was finished? Did you struggle with that? Did you know when you write a book if it's the end?
I knew because of the events that I was wrapping it up, but I struggled with whether or not to add an epilogue. And I finally felt like it really needed an epilogue. Kind of smooth out the circumstances. I didn't intend on including an epilogue originally.
Can you talk, or are you able to, would like to talk a little bit about how you chose? You mentioned you kept 2 of your characters. They'll be in your next book. How did you choose those particular characters, and for what purpose? What drew you to bring them on another journey?
I chose Lucas, who was the narrator. And then I also chose Cotton, who was Lucas's good friend. And for many, many years, Cotton and his uncle, little George, worked on the farm for Lucas's family. And Lucas and Cotton are very, very close. They're almost like brothers. But in the next book, Cotton goes north, and he actually becomes one of the first African-American baseball players for a professional team in the Cleveland area. And Lucas becomes a writer, a freelance writer. So even though their lives have taken very different paths, they still remain in contact and manage to spend a lot of time together. The next book will take place in the early 60s.
Is there a character that you identify with, or would you ever write a character based on your own experiences? I ask because it's sometimes difficult to lay your own life bare on the pages of a book.
I think writers always include snippets from their own life. I probably identify most with Lucas because, like Lucas, there were times in my life where I think I had problems finding my voice and stepping out, speaking up. And part of Lucas's journey is his finding his voice and speaking up. Partly because he realizes there's no one else available to do it. So he has to speak up.
Did Lucas's finding of his voice empower you in any way that you're aware of to strengthen your own voice in the world?
I think writing the book, I think writing any book changes the writer. And we often talk about how a book changes readers, but I think the process of writing a book, especially a novel, also changes the writer. And I think I am more able to speak up and speak out. It's taken me a while to do that, and writers are not usually extroverts. Doing a book talk takes a lot of emotional energy. The writers are happy sitting in their office or sitting in a coffee shop with their pad and whatever, typing away. As writers are comfortable, for the most part, working on their own.
I found it fascinating, and this is around the word truth, and several places in the book someone would say, you know, Granny, just tell them the truth, or Lucas would say, just tell them the truth. And so this idea that the truth, even when it's uncomfortable or not pleasant, is the right or important thing to do, so others have the information they need. And then you've got this twist of a crooked truth. So how do you, was this book born out of some statement around truth or family narratives and the truths we tell and don't tell through the generations? I mean, this book is such an example to me of, you know, a family history and how stories can get passed down in families. And when people don't know pieces of the story, they're not informed about their own lives. So could you just, I feel like I'm rambling, but could you talk a little bit about the theme of truth and how that's important to you in the writing of this book and what you hoped might be opened up about that?
What about the theme of truth in conjunction with family loyalty and duty? And this pulls up the idea of family stories, because I think all families have stories. And some stories are pretty ugly, and families would rather not share or recognize those stories, especially if there has been an issue with drinking or alcohol or some other addiction. And I think they create other stories to kind of cover or mask some of those issues. And I've experienced that, so I could speak to the conflict between what is a family's real story and what is the wished for or desired story. And in reality, I think we all have some of that.
Well, family systems certainly do, for sure, in general. I loved Lucas. I loved his ability to call for the truth and call for the importance of that. And then his use of discernment when he had to decide to tell a truth or not. I don't want to say more because of people who may not have read it, but I just think, for me, one of the most beautiful things about this book is to think about how we tell our truths and at what expense we tell them. Often truth tellers in families aren't the popular ones, but they may be the ones that can open a way for others to find their own truths or to get help. And I feel like Lucas was that character for me.
Now, truth tellers are often avoided or silenced. And I think about Hans Christian Andersen's story of the Emperor's New Clothes. The only one who dared to tell the truth and say he's naked was a little boy.
Sounds biblical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Kristine, is there anything else that you'd like us to know that we haven't asked about? Any words for people who might have a secret desire to write, but want to stay hidden or wonder if it's too much trouble? What gave you the courage to write a book?
I knew I had a story to share, and I thought it was an important story. And I was no longer teaching, so I had some time, and everything seemed to come together, except the manuscript. It took me a long time to get the manuscript together. But if if you have a story to share, get your butt in the chair and start writing. And then don't stick it on a shelf or tuck it in a drawer. Start to circulate it if your goal is to publish. Because nothing will get published if it's stuck in your bottom desk drawer.
Isn't that the story with Gone with the Wind? Didn't Margaret Mitchell put that in a suitcase and somebody found it later? Or does anyone know that story?
Macmillan had heard that somebody in the Atlanta area was writing this massive novel. And he actually came to Atlanta, but she didn't approach him until, as I remember, the day he was leaving. And she had all these chapters of Gone with the Wind stuck in individual brown envelopes, big brown envelopes. So she literally gave him this huge pile of chapters stuck in a brown envelopes the last day he was in Atlanta. But she did say in her will, her brother became the keeper of her manuscript. And she did say that she wanted her early drafts burned. So her brother Stephen did that, and there are very few early copies of her manuscript because he followed her wishes.
Well, thank you for stepping out and having the courage to put your story out there and this beautiful story. And thanks to the Cathedral Bookstore for hosting this. What a gift we have. And the bookstore, Corey, do you want to talk about, just briefly say when the bookstore is open? I want people to know that it's open and people can come by.
Thank you, Barbara, for sure. I wanted to thank all of you for joining us, and thank you, Kristine, for letting the bookstore host this event. This has been great. We do have Kristine's book available on our website if you want to go to thecathedralbookstore.org. We are open. The church is not open, unfortunately, except for outdoor services. But if you'd like to stop by, we have coffee. Great place to sit and read for a little bit. We're open from 10 to 4 on Monday through Friday, and we're open from 9 to 2 on Saturday. We'd love to see you all if you want to pop on in. I also wanted to say, for anybody that's watched this and may want to see bits and pieces of it, we are going to have it posted on our website as well. You can find it if you want to share it with somebody, or if you'd like to go back and listen to what Kristine has to say again. I've really enjoyed this. Once again, thank you, Kristine. Thank you, Barbara, so much for being a part of this. You were awesome.
So good to be with everyone. I want to clarify, because we talked about this earlier. The book is not physically in the bookstore at the cathedral, correct?
The book is physically in the bookstore at the cathedral. We had someone order. They are here at the bookstore.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, blessings on everyone's night, and grateful to be in community with all of you this night. And thank you again. Thanks, Kristine.
Thank you, Kristine. Everybody have a good night. Thank you for joining us.